So thank you guys for joining. My name is Tal Kitron. I'm a tutor and executive function coach with Applerouth, and I've been with the company for about 10 years now. And with the SAT coming up this Saturday for a lot of people, so Saturday, June 3rd is an official SAT and the last one for a couple months. We're going to talk a little bit about just the test itself, maybe some tips and tricks for each section, and some things that you or your student can keep in mind on test day. Applerouth started as a tutoring company. What I love about my position, not as presenter, but as a tutor and coach, is that I have a lot of freedom to teach it my way. We have, of course, templates, but we acknowledge that every student is different, right? I'm able to trust my students, which is very nice. And our three cornerstones at Applerouth are academic tutoring, so that's for in-school, test prep, which is my bread and butter, ACT, SAT, and PSAT. And then a newer thing is executive function coaching, which I can tell you about at the end, but also a very interesting and cool thing. If you have questions today, please put them in the Q&A. I don't anticipate us taking the full hour. Definitely will have you out within the hour. And yeah, we'll tackle some questions at the end. The things I want to make sure that we talk through today: the format of the test, the content and strategies that are applicable, and then just a few techniques that you can immediately apply to a practice test or a real test this Saturday. So first, let's talk scoring. The SAT is 4 sections. It is out of 1,600, and 800 of those points come from the first 2 sections, verbal. The other 800 come from the second 2 sections, which are math. That 1,600 has pretty much been the gold standard for SAT for many years. There was a short time where it was out of 2,400, but even when it changes to digital next year, it's still going to be out of 1,600. This is the scoring scale. Each test is graded on a curve. So knowing that you are kind of being measured up with all the other students taking that same test on that same test date, there is no one good test date or bad test date to take. If anyone has told you that, that's a myth. So like August and October and March and May, there's no evidence that one has an easier curve or harder curve. First, some test strategies that apply to all 4 sections. Active reading is something we're going to talk about a lot in a moment for section 1, reading. But honestly, even on the writing and language sections and the math sections, there's a lot of word problems. So it's important to always have pencil in hand. We call it active because a lot of students kind of start out like this, right? And that's passive, no pencil in hand. And then it usually kind of moves to this, and then eventually that, and then we're kind of sunk. So pen or pencil in hand. And for the SAT, it'll be a number 2 pencil. You want to mark up your test booklet because you can write in that, and you should. Right, and then showing all the work there before bubbling in your answer in the Scantron. And then another rule is don't leave anything blank. So people will run out of time on occasion, but there's no points off for wrong answers. So you may as well guess. That will bring up some strategies for math where a few questions are free response and there isn't a multiple choice. It's important to get to those, right? Because we can't really guess. So even if you do run out of time, bubble in straight down the line instead of going Christmas tree. So you don't want to do A, B, C, D, C, B, A. You'll probably miss all of them. Instead, if you have 5 questions you don't get to, not the end of the world, just bubble one answer and straight down the line. Here it says C, but each of the 4 has a 25% chance. So D all the way down is also fine. That is, again, a myth. People have said, I remember hearing in high school, C is correct more often than the other choices. There's no evidence for that necessarily, but you are better off if you're guessing going straight down the line. That's an important test taking strategy. So let's start with some reading work. This is section 1. It's the longest section. And one thing I kind of like about SAT is that you can get the reading over with first, right? ACT, it's towards the end. Here's our breakdown. At 52 questions and 65 minutes, that's a lot, right? So we don't have that much time to read and do all these questions. This includes 5 passages. So that means 13 minutes per passage, which means 13 minutes to read and do about 10 questions. This is what it would look like to begin with. So this would be a literature passage. You can see here 3 or 4 or 5 paragraphs. This would be on the shorter end of an SAT reading passage. And then you'll see 10 questions attached to it. The biggest pitfall that I notice for a lot of my SAT students is taking too long on this first passage. So maybe we even like this passage type, right? It's a story, kind of interesting, but then people take longer than 13 minutes. We're behind the 8 ball and we end up running out of time late. As opposed to the SAT has more advanced language and generally denser passages, just a little bit tougher. Here are the genres that we will see. Literary narrative passage, which I mentioned, is the first. Social science, politics. So social science is almost always number 2. But once in a while, they flip-flop it with the 4th passage type, which is history. And there will always be 2 natural science passages, numbers 3 and 5. We're going to see graphs and charts on at least 2 of the passages, probably the sciencey ones. Could look like that, could look like this. This is something that's a vestige from the ACT. A lot of the ACT writers and executives moved over to SAT 7 or 8 years ago. And so there's no science section, there's no like data interpretation section. But because of that, on the SAT, you're going to see graphs on reading and writing, and of course on math. The deal with those questions is don't settle and also don't think too hard. You kind of want to be like a 5th grade scientist where you're just matching, right, and not working too hard on this. So the number one most important cornerstone of the reading section, arguably maybe the most important thing when it comes to SAT for someone who has not had any prep, is active reading. The goal of active reading is not to be perfect or annotate perfectly. Nobody will see your notes but you. So our goal is keep the pencil moving to stay alert and awake, and then take notes that will help us when we get to the questions. Here are the 4 main strategies that comprise active reading. So number 1 is we underline key information. A transition word, or sometimes people would rather circle names or dates. So we can use circles. In the booklet, if we don't want to underline a whole long sentence or 2, but it's a good main idea, put a star in the margin so you can remember to come back to it. And to me, this is the most important by far. Instead of calling it annotation, let's just say taking notes. If we can come up with simple notes by each paragraph, paraphrased ideally, so in your own words, then when you're on the questions and answers and you're coming back and forth to the passage, it's a lot more efficient. You've outlined it for yourself and you can really rely on your notes to know if it's positive or negative or where exactly to go. So to me, the underlining and the taking notes are the most important of these. And underlining, I think some tutors really emphasize. For me, it varies from student to student. The most important function in my mind is for just to stay alert and awake and keep from being bored or losing focus. Because over an hour of reading is kind of a long time for a lot of people. So let's look at what that actually looks like. I think 30 to 40% underlined is about right. So here's maybe what I would do here. Here, I might want to add a little note of a new person, so I know where his quote's quoted. And then again here, he's saying something, and you might want to take one more note there of like evolution, superstition. There's no one correct note. There are such things as bad notes. Like, for example, would be a bad note, because you look back at that and like, wait, what? For example, what? So to me, it's going to change from person to person and from passage type to passage type. but this is what it looks like. And if I just see a few notes in the margins, I already know that this person's going to do what, right? I don't even need to see how they answered questions, because I can see, yeah, we've got a little outline, right? And then we can see what's happening. So this is about superstition, our brain evolving, but it says we will never grow out of our tendency. And then there's this person quote. So that's what it looks like. And it can take some time, and students often resist it. They're like, man, I already have trouble with timing. If I start taking notes and marking up the passage, how am I ever going to finish this? The reality is it's actually meant to speed you up, because we're trying to just pick out the main ideas and take a quick note so that when we're on the questions, we can go much more quickly. We don't have to dive back into every single bit. And then remembering that when it comes down to it, what this is an open book test. You got your passage, you got your questions, so you're free to go back and forth. The hard part is in 13 minutes, we don't have time to take 3 or 4 minutes on a question, right? That would cost us. A couple other things on reading, and then we'll do a little recap of some strategies. So I definitely want to talk about evidence-based pairs. The types of questions that you're going to see. So inference is actually kind of rare. We don't want to infer unless we have to, right? Usually the clues are there, we just word match. There are certain vocab questions, going to be probably 7 or 8 out of the 52 questions will be vocabulary. And then 40% are evidence-based questions, which are EBQ pairs. And I think that's the most unique part of SAT reading. Very different from ACT and different from other tests. This is what they look like. So anyone who's at any PSAT or SAT experience recognizes this. And again, for each passage, there's usually 1 or 2 pairs. So it makes up a good 30–40% of the whole section. The strategy that works for most people, and will take a little bit of getting used to, is actually using reading question 1, but then using the lines in question 2 to answer that, and only then going back up to answer question 1. The goal is, instead of having the whole passage where we're answering the first question, we've now narrowed it down to a couple lines, and so it's much more clear what the correct answer would be. So we're going to use those, and then we're going to use that to answer question 1. Kind of feels roundabout, but really tends to work. I was very skeptical when I first did this strategy. So what you're going to see is that second question is which quote provides the best evidence for the previous question. So if you've read that first question and you're not sure, use those line references to figure out where is that question answered. So I'll leave this up for a moment. And I would say the biggest thing is for people to go identify them, right? As soon as you start the reading section, go find all the pairs, because they're treated differently. So you want to circle them together, make sure that you do them differently, because if you can get one, it's very likely to be able to find the match and get the other one. If we don't find the right lines of evidence, we're probably going to miss the first part of that EBQ pair. So a little round of practice. And again, this is without a passage. So this is playing it by ear a little bit. But what we're going to do is use these lines. So I'd read question 32, which is, what does Madison say about a republic? And then effectively, I'm going to block these answers out completely and go see which of these lines give us Madison's opinion about a republic. So we go to 21 to 24 and say, is that Madison's opinion about a republic? Line 30 mentions the word a republic. So that's a good sign, right? And we hopefully find 1, maybe 2, but hopefully 1 answer that's pretty good evidence. And then you go back and answer 32. Well, based on this, it says a republic is something that can be extended over a large region. And so that matches with 32C. Right? Some of these EBQ pairs are super hard. Some of them you immediately can see, well, there's the evidence, here's the match. The final thing on SAT reading that I'd like to point out is that one of the 5 passages will be a comparison passage. That could be anything, literature, science, politics, we don't know. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's always going to be one. We just don't know which one and where it'll be. It will look like passage A and passage B, but the questions won't directly say that. So you'll have to notice the line references or author of passage A, author of passage B to determine which questions refer to which passage. With these, you've got to read carefully. You want to understand the relationship, but the big thing is you want to read them separately. Meaning, first, you're going to read passage A, using our strategies of underlining, taking notes. Let's figure out what this author's point of view was. And then we'll look at the first few questions, which will relate to passage A. So first read passage A and then skip to those questions. And only then do we read passage B, right? So we have less in our working memory, but you can take some notes about how it was similar or different from passage A. And then finally, we'll answer the rest of the questions. So those that relate to the second passage, and of course, the comparison questions, which can be tough. All right, so for that comparison passage, just remembering that you want to split it up, read each passage separately and do the related questions. Don't read both at one time. Some final tips that I wrote up for this reading section. So we're about to move to section 2. But for section 1, here's some just final tips. So what you will expect as the first thing you'll see, they're going to say, SAT reading, section 1, 65 minutes, 52 question, time starts now. And you're going to see a literature passage. I encourage some students to not do that first because, again, it requires a slower reading approach. I think you can get away with fewer notes here, mainly because the questions are going to be about characters, feelings, and relationships, which can be intangible, right? So it's not like I can write a little note for each paragraph and get that. Oftentimes, it's also repetitive, and we're just expanding upon a character and their feelings. Passages 3 and 5 will always be science, and usually passage 2 will be as well. For these, we can read it more quickly. This is where active reading is crucial. Take more notes, but keep them simple. Our goal is to create this very basic outline that we can then refer back to on the questions. So if a question is, what's the purpose of paragraph 2? I can go and consult my notes and say, oh, that was outlining the study, designing a study. And then the one that's hardest for most people is the politics passage. So again, those who have experience with PSAT or SAT probably have seen the memes and know that this is a tough one. Often in the 1700s or 1800s, usually about slavery or civil rights or voting rights or women's rights. And the language can often be very old school and confusing. So what we need to take out of it is author's point of view and the main idea. The questions will come back to that over and over. With this, our goal is going to be process elimination. That's on every section. So beyond active reading, we want to look for bad answers, right? So like words in the choices that the writers put in to make them wrong. We call them throwaways. So process elimination is crucial for this whole test, but especially reading. We are not looking for the best answer. We're just looking for one that makes me feel okay. And then the other thing is skip around on passages if needed, but really we got to skip questions that take too long. So if it's a pair that's just not clicking, got to move past it, right? We want to get to everything. The strategy for each question that I lay out for my students is as follows. So unless it's a pair, right, an EBQ pair that you want to go find, if it's a normal question, start by just paraphrasing it, right? What is this question asking? Next, predict the answer if you can. So sometimes that's not applicable. Third, and probably most importantly, is eliminate the bad answers based on words that the authors put in to make them wrong. Sweeping statements like only, never, always, all, those are usually bad words. We'll then hopefully be down to 2 answers. You match evidence from those choices back to the passage. And in the end, we're not looking for perfect. It's just, hey, I can't argue with that. It is true. That's what makes a good reading answer. So unlike math, where we'll see you can get to a perfect answer, on reading, it's just more, let's find the least wrong answer. So that's section 1. And again, if we've got questions, we'll get to those towards the end. I want to talk a little bit about section 2, writing and language. A lot of people find this to be a little bit of a respite, a break after reading. It's simpler, it's quicker. The curve is harsher. So missing 5 reading questions might cost you 30 points. Missing 5 writing questions might cost you like 60 or 70 points or more, depending on the curve. But we have 4 passages, only 11 questions each, and it's all grammar and rhetoric. What does that mean? Well, if you look on the right-hand side here, number 6 is a grammar question. I know that because there's a no change answer and then just 3 choices. So that's testing some sort of grammar rule. Whereas 7 and 8, they have a task. There's actually a question attached. So those will be different. And we'll talk about how our approach will change. So starting with grammar. Here's an example of a passage where the first 3 questions are all grammar questions. And what we'll see here is a bunch of stuff: punctuation, pronouns, sentence structure, subject-verb agreement, prepositions, redundancy, and more. A big part of this is using the answer choices to decide what's changing from A to B to C to D, and based on that, what's being tested. So I know this is a bit small on screen, but I'd look at number 1 and say, oh, well, this is testing punctuation. And a colon certainly doesn't work there. Earthworms, plants is not one idea. And so then I'd be down to A and B, and it looks like B has a semicolon, which is like a period. So that won't work. For number 2, it's again punctuation. I notice a hyphen. So I want to check, is there another one? Because if there is, it's almost always correct. And I do see it. So that means this part right here would be an appositive clause. So our answer is C, C with a dash. And then finally with number 3, if you see delete the underlined portion, I'd say the number 1 grammar rule is we like short answers. So usually that'll be correct. And in this case, it is, because life is our subject and abounds is our verb. Life abounds at every size, comma, and that's your dependent clause. So process elimination will sometimes come into play here, and thinking about which choices will be the easiest to test. That's a lot of what tutoring is like how to identify what's being tested and what's the easiest route. Right? Always on SAT, you want to find a simple solution so that you're not working too hard, keeping momentum and confidence up and time down. We've seen there that you've got some punctuation rules that people have probably not learned properly or forgotten. So yeah, refreshing those, periods, semicolons, colons, dashes, just knowing how they work. And sometimes even refreshing vocab like independent and dependent clauses, like just knowing what those mean. A lot of people need that. But when in doubt, cut words out, commas too. So if you have options to cut out commas or cut out words, short answers are often good. Here's a little review of some of these punctuation rules. I'll just leave this up for a moment. I like to think of the colon, the one at the bottom, as a drum roll, please. It's 2 dots. So it's, I had one great passion in life, drum roll, please. What was it? Making pizzas. Whereas a semicolon, which is the dot and the comma, that's just exactly like a period. On the SAT and ACT, there is no difference between a period and a semicolon. So those are easy ones to test. And commas, we just got to trust our ear. That can be tougher. Here's a few examples of some clauses questions, all 3 of these. The way number 9 works is I see answer choice D with the semicolon, and I know that that is wrong because this is not a full sentence. I see B and I think, ooh, drum roll please, but wait a second, I need a full sentence before a colon. You can't just stop it after a verb and then introduce. So it's not that. And then between A and C, it's all about trusting your ear. When you read a comma out, obviously on the test, we can't speak out loud, but you can maybe mutter it or hear it in your mind. A is another crucial element in soil is carbon. Fine. C is another crucial element in soil is carbon. Even with that long pause, if that was correct, it would have sounded good. So when in doubt, cut it out. 10's easier because A and B are identical. There's no functional difference between A and B, so we know they're both wrong. That's awesome. And then D is what we call a run-on or a comma splice. When you have an independent clause, full sentence, and then another one, you can't do that. That's a run-on. So this is correct. Next is 11. I see a bunch of hyphens. You always want to look and see if there's another one, which again, there is. So that opened a positive clause, and I think we want to close it after scraps, but then they wouldn't make much sense. So which contain. So that one's going to be B. You can see process elimination is helpful, but you really got to kind of know the rules, and there aren't that many. So it's easy to kind of refresh and then practice, right? And that's what Applerouth's online program, you can self-study, but of course, group classes, individual tutoring can go a long way too. About 40-ish% at least of the writing section is going to be rhetoric. So you've got all these grammar questions, right, about pronouns and possession and all these rules. But then you've got these rhetorical skills questions as well. Some things they might have you do would be combine sentences, maybe place them differently. So like sentence 2 might move, where should it go? Maybe they might ask you to add or delete sentences and why. And what they all come down to is staying on topic and flowing smoothly, but also we want to be robotic. So unlike on grammar where your ear is important and it has to sound good, don't care about that at all when you've got a question. Here the question is, provide specific information about her brother's hobbies. That's our task. That's the job the test writers have asked me, the test taker, to do. So I go back to the passage on the left, and this is what's underlined. So I just want to find the answer that's the most specific about the hobbies, and is very clearly B. Unlike grammar, where the longest answer is usually wrong, on rhetoric, it could be fine, right? In this case, it gives me the most information. It accomplishes my task, which is specific info about the hobbies. So don't overthink. And if it seems super easy, that's okay. That means you found the trick. These question types are often pretty tough at first, but if you get a hang of it, they can be actually a gift and the easiest questions. If you do find yourself really strong with grammar, but not as much with rhetoric or vice versa, feel free to do one question type and skip the others and then come back, right? That's totally allowed. So again, specific information, that's going to lead us straight to B. My final tips on this section, section 2. Number 1, for grammar, people don't use the answer choices enough. We don't really need to read the passage. We go right to left, and then if we need context, we then read. For grammar, short is sweet. We like parallel structure, and we like things that sound good. So learn your grammar rules and trust your ear. And then for rhetoric, you just want to be a robot. Robotically determine what is the job the test writers have asked me to do, and then be a word matcher. Our job is stay on topic and transition smoothly. So if it shouldn't be added, it'll be pretty clunky. Look not just at what you're placing or adding, but also at what's around it, because that's the stuff that's stuck in place. All right, so those are the big shifts on the writing section, grammar versus rhetoric. And of course, within grammar, there's like 12-ish different topics that you want to identify. All right, last bit is some math, which is probably the biggest area of divergence between SAT and ACT. The College Board is all about Common Core math, so really a ton of algebra. These first 2 things are just about all algebra. You're going to see a lot of functions, which is plugging in, lines, y equals mx plus b, inequalities, and then treating this like with graphs and words and math, and translating words into real life and math into real life and so on. Then you've got this passport to advanced math, which includes more about exponents and roots and factoring and foiling and vertices and polynomials and parabolas. And then the third big part is stats. These tend to be the easiest questions for people. They're actually on the calculator section, and we never need the calculator. So some probability, but a lot of just mean, median, mode. got to know like what a histogram is and a box and whisker plot and some things maybe people haven't ever done. But the big ones are mean, median, mode, standard deviation, range, just understanding what those are. And that brings in some arithmetic type stuff too, like percents and proportions. Beyond that, so the ACT is a lot more topics. The ACT is know a little bit about a lot. The SATs know a lot about a little. So it's mostly algebra plus a little geometry, a little bit of trig, and you will get these formulas at the beginning of the section. The ACT, on the other hand, will test these a lot and don't give you formulas. The SAT tests them sparingly, but you at least have these. So just knowing that those special right triangles are there, an area and circumference, being ready to go back and find those. A lot of people forget that they have them. And for most people, if you're a junior taking the SAT and geometry was in 9th grade, we've already forgotten a lot of it. So that's a pretty common thing that as a tutor I encounter. So don't sleep on that. It's not every formula we'll need, but it's the main ones. And we mentioned that this is really a reading test. So here's what I mean by that. This is an example of a question 4, which is a pretty early question, and then a question 20 on a calculator section, which would be middle to late. And for this one, it's all about translating. So I always like to start with what are we solving for? Which on number 4 is, what is the meaning of the value 108? This is a modeling question. So the way I work with students on this is I tell them, this is just a line. It's y equals mx plus b. This is your x value. For every question like this, if you plug in d is 0 and d is 1, and then translate what happened, we're going to be okay. So the way this one works is when d is 0, p is 108. I could just plug in d is 0 and I'll see p is 108. What does that mean? That means if she has worked 0 days, so Kathy has worked 0 days, and at that time, P, which is the number of phones left she has to fix, so she has 108 phones to fix. And as soon as I plug in D equals 1, I'll know the meaning of everything. Because when D equals 1, we will subtract 23. And P is now going to be 85. What does that mean? Kathy has worked 1 day, and now she only has 85 phones left to fix. So the meaning of 108 was, that was how many phones she had at 0 days. Well, that's answer choice B. The others are all kind of messed up. I think 20, first off, based on where it is in the test, is going to be harder. Number 20 rather than 4, but it also is just a tough question, and percents can be confusing. One recommendation I have here is picking 100 as a number to start with. So like if the original price was $100 and we got an 80 or 20% discount, that's $80. She paid P dollars, which is the 80 discount plus an 8% sales tax on that discounted price. The way to write that is like this, or if you think about the invisible 1 in front of the 80, this is really just 100% of 80 plus 8%. So she's paying the discounted price plus an 8% tax. That's what this looks like. And the question is, what represents the original price in terms of P? So this would be calculator section. I would go ahead and punch this in, because again, I picked numbers so that it would make it real. That means P is 86.40, but our original price was 100. So now to find the answer that's correct, we would plug in 86.40 to each of these P's and see which one gets you back to 100. And if I remember correctly, I believe it's going to be D as in dog, but let's just make sure. So 0.8 times 1.08. That's where that 0.864 comes from. And 86.4 over that will give you back to 100. The answer is D. If that doesn't make perfect sense, that's okay. The big thing here is understanding that most people are going to be super confused and honestly will get this wrong. But picking C most often. So picking numbers can help you make it real, but this might also be a question that a lot of people should skip. It's time consuming, it's confusing. If you know percents are not a strong suit, maybe you skip it and come back. Right? But picking 100 is a nice thing for percents just to make it a bit more real. What's our strategy? So I'll get into this a little bit more too at the end, but basic strategy for each part of this test is read carefully. So circle what you're solving for. Sometimes we solve for X, we think we're done, but actually we needed 2X. Translate word problems into math whenever we can, and write those down in the booklet. Make sure you show your work. If it's calculator section, use your calculator. We can do matrices on the calculator. We can graph stuff. We can do log, base, combinations, permutations, turn decimals into fractions. And most students don't have a knowledge of all the stuff they can do with their TI 83 or 84. And then if you have time, check your answer. This is kind of a tough one. So like sometimes we're strapped for time, we aren't able to do that. But if it's something where you can just plug in real quick, where you got a degree measure and you want to see, does that look right? Do a quick double check. Something that I will say that is not true on ACT. ACT, at least, it's mostly like there's a math thing to do and you can get a perfect answer. A lot of times on SAT, it's actually about just understanding the equation and then extrapolating from that. Sometimes you don't actually have to do the math or actually solve for anything. So like right here is an example. We've got X terms and Y terms. It's not linear. It says it's a polynomial, which means it's parabolic, probably. And the question is, which of the following could define this function? So here, we're really looking at x-intercepts, zeros, solutions. A says I've got a 0 at 5 and -2, which if I look at the answer or the table, that's wrong. If I have the point -5, 0, that comes from the factored form x plus 5. So A gets it wrong, but the other ones get it right. From here, I'd be looking at whether x should be a factor, which would only be true if we've got the point 0, 0, and we do. So I think we can cross out B just based on that. Haven't done any real math yet. But then actually to solve between these two, I'd probably plug in a point. 0, 0 won't do me any good, but if I plugged in this point, it will only work for one answer. In this case, it's C, because for choice D, x equals 1 will give you y is -6. So didn't have to understand deeply what's going on, didn't have to graph it, just need to understand x-intercepts in factored form. So some Algebra 1 review. SAT is a lot about conceptual understanding. Section 3, which comes right after writing, you get a break and you get launched into section 3. It's pretty fast paced, 25 minutes for 20 questions. The rule is that the first 15 are multiple choice and they get harder as they go. So I'll just write that here. So 1 through 15, multiple choice, harder as they go. And then 16 through 20 are grid-ins, free response questions that start off pretty easy. So knowing that if you get stuck late in multiple choice, jump to the grid-ins. This question a lot of people miss. The question is, which of these following statements is true? So must be true. The key here is just that squared, because anything squared is at least 0. So no matter what I plug in for x, right? If I plugged in 3, then I get 3 minus 3, which is 0 squared, which is 0. So that's not true. And then this also wouldn't have been true because x was 3 and y was 0. So then just to pick between A and C, well, let's just pretend x was 50. Pretty clear that y is not going to be less than 3. But because this is squared, the lowest y could ever be is 0. So it'll definitely be greater than -2, in fact, greater than -1. That's question 1 on a test, which is pretty rough. I'd say that's hard as compared to most question 1s, but the logic behind it is sound and the solution isn't too complex. People work too hard there. We're going to need to isolate variables and move x's and y's and plug in a lot and be careful with negative signs and be able to do fractional exponents and stuff like that. So a lot of algebra review, and usually this stuff comes back to students quite quickly. They often have it already in their minds. Take a look at this question. There's a mega shortcut, but here's a very typical Algebra 1 question, factoring. So the first thing you want to check on this is probably whether it's factorable, right? If I have ax squared plus bx plus c, we want to remember that as factored form, standard form. And if we can factor it, then we'll have the intercepts solutions right there. So first we rewrite it, x squared minus 6x minus 27. And then we hopefully remember how to factor. The two numbers that multiply to negative 27 but add to negative 6 are minus 9 and 3. But remember, we're looking for what values of x will make y 0. So we flip the signs for the solutions. So 9 and negative 3 are the solutions. And then we want to make sure we add them. Sum means add. So our answer is going to be B. The mega shortcut is if we are in standard form, ax squared plus bx plus c, the sum of solutions is actually always just negative b over a. So if you're an SAT expert and you do this for a long time, you'll see, oh, that's just negative 6 over 1. That's how you find the sum. I don't expect people to know that, but I would expect them to know how to factor that and find solutions. So that's a fairly typical concept and question type. And what you'll often see on the calculator section, like I said, is there's no use for a calculator. Here, I mean, the biggest thing that people do is they solve for x and they think they're done. But we're not looking for x, we're looking for 24 over x. So let's recopy the question. 3 over x equals 15 over x plus 16. And a lot of people need a review here, but when you have a fraction equaling a fraction, we're going to cross multiply. So 3 times parentheses x plus 16 equals 15 times x. We combine like terms by moving the 3x over, divide both sides by 12, and we'll find that x is 4, which is an answer choice, but not our answer. It's 24 over 4, which is A, 6. And I can't count the number of times a student's done all the right math and then just picked C and figured, I got it, but they solved for the wrong thing. They just solved for X. The deal with that section 4, it's another long one. So this can be a little bit draining. Mental stamina is a big thing at the end of the test. 38 total questions, 55 minutes for that. The first 30 are multiple choice. And then the final 8 are what we call grid-ins or free response. Take a look at this question here just for a moment. Kind of a disturbing statistic. But we read the question, we look at what we're solving for. And this is another one where I would immediately plug in 0 and 1. Again, just making it real because I know at 0 minutes, 0 hamburgers have been eaten. So this cannot be right because if I plug in m is 0, I'm still going to be left with 60. So that one won't work. But then if m is 1, well, okay, it's going to be 1,500 hamburgers per second. So it'll be 60 times that in a minute. And then 45% of 60 times that. So actually, there should be no division. I might punch some stuff into the calculator to prove it on this one, because a lot of people are picking B. But the logic is, if it happens this many times in 1 second, it'll be 60 times that in 1 minute. But again, I think without plugging in 0, 1, or some numbers, it's so abstract that it's hard to conceptualize. So that's why the SAT can be tough for people. Sometimes if math is not your strong suit, ACT can be a good test because the reading and English are a little bit simpler, though they're faster paced. Just, I think, 1 or 2 more questions here. This is exponential modeling. Again, notice calculator section, but calculator not necessary. This one should be pretty easy to get it down to 2 because we're looking at a 19% increase. So if we're just modeling, the calculator probably won't do us much good. I think the exponents part of this, x over 3 or 3x, is going to be tricky. So I'm not going to go there yet. But because it's not exponential decay, I do think we can cross out A and B. Both C and D show a 19% increase, each whatever, and both A and B show a 19% decrease, 100 minus 19 divided by 100. So if we want it to be every 3 years, this is again where plugging in makes your life easy. So that means when x is 3, the exponent should be 1. It should happen 1 time. That is C. People are always tempted by choice D, but this means it happens 3 times every year and 9 times in 3 years. So this is good to know. Our intuition might tell us D, but it's actually going to be division for happening once every 3 years. And that's number 13, so middle difficulty. I think that's reasonably tough, as long as, but if you know the rule, you're going to be okay. And then here's another one. This is a word problem that I think is super hard. Shifting probability. This would be towards the very end of the test. It's a grid in. I'm still doing fine on time. So here what we've got is information about Darnell's farm. He's got 160 chickens, but he's buying more. So that number is going to change. And then he's got 80 cows, but that number won't change. The mistake people make is that he's got 240 total animals, but they forget that they will add to the denominator as well. So the way to actually do this isn't to look at the part that's changing. It's going to be to look at the cows, because the cows, there are 80 of them and there won't be any more. So watch how that looks. Chickens are being added, cows are 80, it's going to stay 80. If 20% of the animals are cows, then we can use that 80 and say 80 equals 20% of the total. Then you can divide both sides by 0.2 and you'll get that the total is 400 animals, meaning he's got 320 chickens. And then what are we solving for? Oh, well, how many chickens did he buy? So he's got 320, which means he bought an additional 160. I'd say that's quite a tough question, probably one of the tougher ones we've seen so far. So my final advice on math, always think about what am I solving for? People overlook that. What do I already know? The SAT writers will give you all the clues you need. They're not hiding the ball. And then what else do I need to know? Because no calculator gets harder as it goes, you'll see like numbers 10 through 15 being very difficult. You don't want to run out of time there. So it's important to get to the grid-ins with time to spare. Number one, because you can't guess on those, right? It's a free response. Whereas if you guess on number 15, you have a 1 in 4 shot at worst. And also the grid-ins reset. So whereas 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 are tougher, 16 is going to be one of the easiest questions, like number 1. Staying on calculator, tougher, all the way to 30. So like numbers 15 through 30, you'll see some tough multiple choice questions. And as soon as you get to 31, oh man, this is easy again. It'll be like a one-step question. So prioritize easy points, make sure you get to those grid-ins. And this is what I usually tell students. I don't think this is in like Applerouth materials, but most SAT math questions, almost every single one, boil down to these 5 things. And they're basic algebra. Algebra 1, can I isolate X or a variable? Can I substitute a number or plug in or something? Can I distribute, which we've done some today? Are there like terms to combine and put together or subtract from both sides? We've seen factoring or foiling. That's the other one. If you can't do any of those basic things, so there's just nothing to do, then think about the answer choices. If it's like 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, wow, those are lovely. Plug them in. If it's not, if it's like A and X to the -1 and B over 3, then maybe we pick our own numbers like we did with percents in that hamburger question, because it's less abstract, right? Keeping it more real will breed understanding. So even on math, if you get stuck, before you skip, see if those answer choices can help you. Final points across the board. Answer what the question's actually asking. Be detail-oriented. Leave nothing blank across all 4 sections. Think about skipping around on passages and sections to get easy points. And remember that you're one of many, many people taking this test. That always helped calm me a bit. It's like, I'm not the only one in this boat. So I thought, like the test writers, I would use those answer choices to think, well, why did they put this here? And if you get stuck, be ready to skip, but also be ready for a simple method of solving, right? It's usually simpler than people think, and they're often tending to work too hard. Remember that the June test will take a long time to get the scores back because they're also grading APs. We've got a very cool promo going on right now. The, I guess, best deal is you can get, if you buy, I want to say 36 hours, you can lock in the lowest rate. That's 6 free tutoring hours. So that's a good value. A lot of people do the 20-hour package, which is 4 free hours, but this is all month, so it just started. And we're going to put a link in the chat if anyone wants to reach out to Applerouth because they're interested in understanding more about prep or the SAT or the presentation. So that's going to go into the chat in a moment. We're also going to launch a quick quiz, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. We've got a few minutes for that. So remember that we covered a ton of ground. You'll see that poll pop up and the link will go in the chat. You can also email info@applerouth.com or call the number below just for more info. And if you do talk with an advisor, there's no pressure or anything. Most of our PAs have been tutors or really understand quite well like what students need and that everyone's different. So I highly recommend that. And yeah, let's just see if there's any thoughts or questions about the SAT with this one coming up this weekend. As I always do right before the test, my students, I just lay out the list of things to bring. So if you are taking the test this weekend, good luck. Remember that test scores don't define you, and you've got plenty more cracks at taking the SAT. It's offered in August, in October, in November, and December, and March and May and June. So if you're taking it on Saturday, I would say you want to bring your admissions ticket. You got to print that from the College Board website. Bring an ID that has to be like a government issued photo ID, so driver's license, passport. You want to bring pencils with erasers. You want to bring a snack and some water and comfortable clothes, warm in case they keep it super cold in there. Calculator, of course, make sure it's charged and in degree mode. And that's pretty much it. Mask if you're supposed to have one at that facility. One question I've got here is about practice tests. Practice tests are golden. The thing about practice tests is a lot of people just do test, and they don't take the time to review them really carefully. A mock test is only as good as working through the results and how much you do that after. So like in a first session with a student, I'm always going to be looking at their baseline mock test and work through questions they missed. It is single-handedly the best review because, hey, we took a full test and we can pinpoint the question types that gave us trouble. Where do I run out of time? Right, and working back through those is absolutely golden. So yeah, I definitely recommend practice tests. Ideal world, you would do like a 90-minute session of tutoring once per week. Every few weeks, you would knock out a mock test, and we'd always have homework between each session. And then before like an official SAT, I'd want to do at least 2 mock tests, like a baseline and a regular one. Yeah, maybe 3 mock tests per real test. Yeah, making sure you're using good materials and that you're really learning from the results, right? More is not better if you're not breaking those results down. Yeah, that's a good question. couple more minutes. Of course, if you don't have questions and are satisfied, you are welcome to call it an evening. I appreciate you joining, but I'm just leaving it open for 2 more minutes here. You're very welcome. All right, seeing no more questions. Hope you guys got a lot out of today. Please feel free to reach out. You can request to work with me as the tutor. Yeah, good luck on the SAT, and thank you so much for joining. Have a great rest of your evening.